Hello, I'm Sakina Al-Haddad. I'm a lecturer at Learning Futures, and today I'd like to talk to you about compassionate learning and teaching. Paul Gilbert, who is one of the leading researchers in this branch of clinical psychology, defines compassion as the sensitivity to the suffering in self and others, with a commitment to try to alleviate and prevent it. And so there are two key elements to this. One is that deliberate engagement or tuning in to the suffering, and that is both of the self and others. And the second element to that is that of action. So compassion-motivated action addresses the need to, or the issue of alleviation and prevention of suffering. And so this suggests that human compassion is not just an automatic or simply an emotional response to suffering, but rather it's one that involves the deliberate cognitive and motivational processes. Now, a good example in the current COVID-19 pandemic is the act of staying home. So that is an act of compassion, motivated by the intention to prevent the suffering of others, particularly of those who may be exceptionally vulnerable to this infection. Another good example is the sensitivity to that additional student challenges currently. And the act of removing the recording of fails this trimester is an act of compassion, which alleviates some of the stress that students may already be currently experiencing right now in the transition to online amidst the pandemic. We engage in the processes of compassion-motivated actions in the learning and teaching context. What this means is that our intentions, decisions, and actions in learning and teaching are deliberately focused on alleviating or preventing suffering or challenges that might occur in our learning and teaching practice. So typically, this is aligned to critical or social justice-oriented education. So strategies there are focused on supporting disadvantaged students in order to succeed, and these are often underpinned by compassionate mechanisms. For me, as an educator, compassion is a value that I hold. And so the commitment that I make is to look at the evidence base that supports the considerations and decisions that I might need to make in order to alleviate or prevent further disadvantages or challenges that some students might face in order to help them succeed in higher education. So this might mean specifically reading up on intersectionality or allyship, or experiences of first-in-family students, for instance, or even any of the challenges that students typically experience in learning, and then subsequently devising strategies to support my students through, say, my learning design or teaching, or even in thinking about ways in which I might communicate. Now, while compassionate learning and teaching aligns really well with social justice education, compassion-motivated acts can also be integrated in our learning and teaching practice through really quite simple acts of compassion. And you might find that you're already doing this. So in the context of the pandemic, the impetus really now shifts to the intention of alleviating and preventing further suffering as we all face additional stress and challenges in the global pandemic. And one consideration, of course, is that those who may already have been disadvantaged previously, this pandemic does exacerbate those circumstances. And so here, one of the key mechanisms we focus on is the role of stress in learning, acknowledging that emotion, social, motivational, and cognitive factors are all inextricably linked in learning. And so I'll try to illustrate the evidence base for this impetus, noting that, of course, there's much more complexity to this. And I'm about to intentionally oversimplify this for now, at least for the purpose of illustrating the basis for why compassion-motivated teaching is important during this time of additional stress and anxiety.
It's sometimes thought that the more stress you have, the less productive you'll be. The relationship between stress and learning or performance is not quite that linear, and it does depend on many factors. Some stress is actually good for us. It stimulates us to pay attention, to focus, take action, and take interest in things, up to a point. Eventually, the level of stress becomes too much, leading to impaired learning and performance.
We can think of parts of this curve as zones. In the first, we know that the stress is useful in picking one's interest and attention so that they can focus on a task. However, if it's too easy, then boredom might set in. The next zone can be thought of as the optimal zone of stress and performance, where there is just enough stress for one to optimally engage in the task and learn. The final zone can be thought of as the zone of high stress and low function. Now, a number of factors can contribute to a person feeling overstressed, and this can include fatigue, task difficulty, baseline levels of stress, or even perception of stress. Considering baseline levels of stress is important. For example, someone with a high level of stress, particularly where the source of stress has little focus of control for change, means that they're more likely to operate within this zone. During this global pandemic, we'd expect almost everyone's levels of baseline to be more around here. Whereas previously, we might assume a wider range of variability across the whole curve. Remembering, of course, that those who are already disadvantaged are likely to have these further exacerbated during this time. Compassionate learning and teaching during this time means to deliberately focus our efforts on alleviating some of these stresses that's more within our control. We can't control the pandemic, not much more other than staying at home and maintaining hygiene, for instance. But we can do simple acts of compassion to relieve some of the stresses that we all face, including our students, through our learning and teaching practices. What we'll try to do is to do some of those things that's within our control to try and move them more into the optimal zone.